I am Slava Silva. Welcome to Conversations with Slava. Today I'm talking to Tom Mills. You are a lecturer in sociology at Aston University and the author of the BBC Myth of a Public Service. Dr. Mills, why is BBC in particular expected to provide a public service?
Well, it's in its constitutional remit. It's more or less the founder of the concept of public service broadcasting, so the idea that you would have an organisation which isn't influenced by economic interests or by the state, and that would operate independently of those social interests and offer a public interest for not only news and journalism, which I suspect is probably we'll spend most of our time talking about, but also entertainment and documentary programming and the rest of it. So the BBC is constitutionally obliged to provide those things. It's in the UK a dominant provider of news, and internationally it's a respected founder of the tradition of public service broadcasting, which is basically the dominant idea and institutional form that's acted as an alternative to the capitalist media in the 20th century. I mean, that's coming under all kinds of pressures for various reasons, but that's why the BBC is particularly important as a symbol of a certain alternative form of media production, but also as an actually existing institution that provides something of an alternative to those institutional forms which represent particular interests.
If not the public, whom has it been serving?
Well, this is more or less what my book is about, really. The BBC is there's a lot of research on how the BBC reports, and generally speaking, the way that it tends to report, it tends to reflect the interests of powerful interests in society. So that's, particularly corporations, the state had a very close relationship to the state since the earliest days, since the founding of the BBC in the 1920s. And, as more or less, as far as we know from research, always reflected the dominant economic interests in society over other interests. So it will tend to represent the opinion of business owners and managers over that of workers. It will tend to reflect elite opinion on a whole range of issues, particularly on its dominant news services. So those are the interests that it tends to represent predominantly, and you can find that if you look at research examining media content, but also if you look specifically at the BBC's history. And we know quite a lot about the BBC because there's quite a rich archival record detailing the BBC's editorial processes, the relationship between the senior members of the BBC and governments. There tends to be a relatively sort of close relationship there between the people who are most important in establishing what constitutes impartiality, which is an important concept that the BBC uses, and the operatives in the state. Now, the other element that I talk about and go into some detail in the book, which is the main focus of my own research, has been looking at the BBC's relationship with economic elites. So in other words, the proverbial sort of 1%, but also the dominant corporations and the dominant economic interests in society. There was a process of change that the BBC went through from, roughly speaking, the late 1970s up to the mid-2000s, where the BBC became much more pro-business, became much more reflective of those interests. So the short answer is that the BBC has always reflected the interests of the dominant political interests in society, but that became really accelerated, particularly in terms of economic power in the late 20th century and early 21st century. So we're left with the BBC now, which represents basically the balance of power in Westminster. So in other words, the formal balance of power in the political system, but also largely the interests of economic elites. And that puts the BBC under considerable strain, particularly in periods of political crises, but also in periods of social and economic crisis, because the further away the political elite, if you want to call them that, come from the population at large, the public, the more difficult balancing that is for the BBC to negotiate. But equally, as you get a more unequal society in terms of economic distribution, then the way that the BBC has to explain that to its public again comes under strain. So basically, I think in broad brush strokes, you can say that the BBC is always trying to ride two horses, as it were, like one, the interests of the elite, and the other, the interests of the public, and that's become increasingly difficult to do that. There's divisions have emerged between the two, but also there's certain fractures have opened up within the elite themselves.
What do you mean? What fractions are you talking about?
I'm talking about particularly the last 5 years, where there's been a split within the political elite, particularly. I mean, two basic things really, which have characterised the last half a decade and represent something of a symptom of political crisis in the UK. The first is the debates around Brexit and exit from the European Union, which created the significant split within Westminster opinion and also the public at large, but also the rise of Corbyn in the Labour Party, which basically pulled the political elite to the left, because for the first time in its history, the Labour Party had a leader who was a socialist, who represented a broad swathe of opinion in British public opinion, which is normally not represented in elite politics. So around fairly moderate policy options like provision, nationalisation of key utilities, an increase in tax in high income earners, greater moderate distributional policies, things which would have been fairly moderate in the social democratic period, which had basically been locked down by the neoliberal period. That all split open with Corbynism, and that put the BBC under strain, along with Brexit as well. And the thing is with Brexit was that you had a split in public opinion, but you also had expert opinion and the majority of the corporate elite who didn't want to leave the EU. But you also had a split within Parliament as well, and that played out in complex ways around the political, the formal political system. So all of that put some strain on the BBC.
And another subject you addressed is the term impartiality. What did objectivity, impartiality, and balance mean at the BBC, and what do they mean now?
Well, I mean, actually, it's funny because a lot of these terms weren't really defined that clearly in the first few decades of the BBC. It really wasn't until the 1970s that people at the BBC started to articulate the idea of impartiality and what that meant in particular political circumstances. And the reason they started doing that in the 1970s was that they became, for the first time really, felt under significant political pressure. And in some ways, there's been resonances with that in the way that the BBC has been treated in the last decade, where the BBC, was being attacked by the left and by the right, and this is a symptom of political crisis. What the BBC started to do then was started to sort of articulate a set of principles which guide its reporting, formalise them, and these became, sort of written rules rather than unwritten rules of reporting. But the basic original principle was that the BBC shouldn't be taking sides in political debate, that it should be trying to communicate both sides of political arguments to viewers. And the reason for this basically was that the politicians themselves didn't want the BBC to be, captured by partisan political interests. Now, we could have all kinds of debates about what impartiality, objectivity, or balance means, but in practice, I don't think any of that's really necessary, because the BBC has never reported impartially on any key political issues. So the point at which the principle of impartiality starts to kick in, particularly, it's actually not called impartiality, it's called due impartiality. So they sort of have this sort of moderation of the principle, and it particularly comes into play at points at which issues are controversial. So issues of, classically of like industrial conflict, when they started to formulate these policies, but really what they mean is politically controversial issues which touch on powerful interests. Now, basically what impartiality means in practice is that any powerful interests will get treated in a fair and balanced fashion in BBC reporting, and that the BBC will basically try and balance between different parts of elite opinion, and that's how actually existing impartiality works. And that usually means balance. So that's how impartiality gets implemented in reality. What you're supposed to do with impartiality is you're supposed to look at the different available arguments in society, and you're supposed to be able to present that to viewers in a way that will allow them to make up their own minds about particular issues, to draw attention to what's at stake and the political differences and so on. How it usually gets operationalized is, one side says this, the other side says that, with no real critical assessment of the strength of the different kinds of opinions. So basically, in practice, and if you look at any key issue that touches on powerful interests in society, like the BBC tends not to treat them impartially. Like usually there's a skewed balance against less powerful interests, and that's not really very surprising if you consider the sort of sociology of the BBC. I mean, people who are able to complain and to people who are considered to be noteworthy or important are able to persuade the BBC to report in a more amenable fashion than people who are not considered to be important. I mean, that's to put the matter slightly crudely, but I mean, these things are sort of internalized in the way that impartiality is actually operationalized. Now, I think in terms of people who criticize the BBC, I mean, it's often, the focus is often that, this is sort of a farce, that objective journalism can never exist, which is sort of true to some degree, and perfect impartiality can't be reached. And again, I mean, that's true. There isn't some sort of God's eye view on society which every issue could be balanced out in a fair and impartial fashion all of the time. But my own view is that I think impartiality is a good political principle. I mean, we could talk about it a bit more if it's interesting to you, but to me, I would respond to the questions around impartiality with, sort of paraphrase what Gandhi said about Western civilization. I mean, I think it would be a good idea for the BBC to be impartial. The problem is that it hasn't been, and it hasn't been for reasons which I think could be addressed. So I think it would be useful to have an impartial broadcaster. We just don't have it. And that's partly why the book is called The Myth of the Public Service, because the BBC sort of embodies a certain promise that it's never been able to deliver on for certain reasons.
Had Jeremy Corbyn become Prime Minister, the BBC wouldn't have been differential to the Corbyn government, the same way it used arguably to be differential to other governments, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's obviously, it's a hypothetical question, but my take on this would be that probably the BBC would have been more deferential to Corbyn had he been Prime Minister than they were when he was leader of the opposition. There's lots of reasons for that. Number one, they're broadly respecting of democratic politics. So, in the UK, and they will usually award a certain authority to somebody who has a democratic mandate. And if Corbyn had won that, it would be very, very unlikely that Corbyn would have won a majority. So let's just imagine that he had. I think that would have made a difference. I think also there's other elements. I mean, once you're within the machinery of the British state, that gives you certain sort of communicative advantages. That means you can be more dominant in media output. So that's the other thing. The difference would have been there would have been other interests in society which the BBC would have considered to be important, which would have been elevated in criticisms of the government. So I think, opposition voices would have been taken much more seriously. And that would have been because the people around the BBC, the broader sort of public opinion to which the BBC is orientated, which essentially is elite opinion, would have been much more critical of the government. The BBC would have seen it as democratic purpose to be critical of the government. If you think about the way that British journalists tend to operate, there's kind of always kind of functional contradiction in terms of how they consider themselves to be operating. On the one hand, they're very slavishly obedient in terms of how they criticize power, in terms of how they scrutinize policy, in terms of their approach to power. On the other hand, they see themselves as being oppositional. And I think there's this, and this is just impressionistic rather than scholarly, but my sense is they would have enjoyed the opportunity to be critical of the government without really touching on those sort of key interests in society. And actually, I think that was probably part of the attraction for some liberal journalists of being able to attack Corbyn and Corbynism so strongly when Corbyn was leader of the opposition, was that this was justified actually as holding into account somebody who would be Prime Minister without ever having to sort of deviate from those core interests in society. they were basically reflecting the critical opinions of the establishment, whilst being able to reassure themselves that they were performing their constitutional obligations, the whole power to account. And I think my guess is you would have probably seen a lot of that had Corbyn got into Downing Street, would have had a lot of briefings against the government from institutions and people who the BBC deemed to be important. So the short answer to your question is yes, I think the BBC would have been more differential of Corbyn, but a lot less differential of Corbyn than it would have been a Corbyn as Prime Minister than it has been of any other Prime Minister in its history.
Could you explain how the BBC has come to have the outlook that it has? For example, you write, in combination with the strong off-speech orientation, there has, since the 1990s especially, been a greater movement of personnel between the BBC and Westminster. How does that happen?
How does that happen? Well, I mean, it just happens that people move jobs and the government hire people from the BBC and the BBC hire people from the government. I mean, this isn't something unique to the BBC. I mean, if you look at, for example, Aaron Davis's work on the British elite, you see this as being a sort of feature of elite life, if you want to call it that, in the neoliberal period, which is this greater sort of precarity and circulation of figures, the so-called revolving door between different positions. Now, that happened at the BBC. There were lots of different aspects behind that and shifts to the political economy. And at the BBC, basically, there was a conscious effort to marketize the BBC in the 1990s under the directorship of its then Director General John Burt, who was Deputy Director General, and he was sort of a key driver of change at the BBC in the neoliberal period, so after Thatcher. He had a big interest in marketizing it. And one element of that, was actually very actively recruiting people from the private sector and to the BBC. And he brought in a lot of people who were, from the financial press, and in fact, who had come from the diplomatic world. People like Peter Jay, who was a close friend of his, who was a former Times journalist, who was sort of advocate of monetarism, very influential sort of figure in the 1970s. So they very consciously sort of created more of a market model at the BBC, and that meant that you didn't have what they used to call BBC lifers. In other words, somebody who would start at the BBC at the bottom, spend your whole career there. It was sort of seen as a virtue that people would move in and out at the BBC. And then, within journalism specifically, you have a rise of, in the same period, of people with particular expertise in things like PR and strategic communications and so on, and this became a budding sort of industry. So not just at the BBC, but within journalism itself, you have a lot of people moving in from strategic communications, which is essentially, private propaganda, into media organizations and back into PR organizations and in politics into political strategy. And they're taking with them their expertise and their contacts books, basically. And it's all really part of an instrumentalization of the media. So you get the sort of breakdown of this sort of liberal model where you would have journalists holding politicians to account, and then you get the sort of moving towards the merging of these different sectors and the movement of personnel in and out of those sectors. So the BBC is really just one small element of that. We saw recently an example of this, and every so often it happens that somebody moves in and out of the BBC, and they get recruited into political journalism, and there's debates around revolving door and so on. But it's been a feature of the BBC for quite some time, and I mean, it obviously raises issues about the capacity for people at the BBC, for journalists, to be able to hold politicians to account. But it's also a feature of a broader phenomenon, which is that, these are people broadly operating in the same, social universe. They went to the same sort of schools. They all live in the same sorts of neighborhoods in London. They all attend the same parties. They all read the same newspapers. They're all drawn from broadly the same social strata. So, sorry, it's a very broad answer, but like what you're drawing attention to is, I think, a very small phenomenon and part of a broader problem, I think, that we can just see in that kind of small phenomenon of BBC journalists switching jobs.
The people defending the current arrangement would probably argue that drawing journalists from these schools gives them the best skilled, the smartest people, gives the best experiences, the best contacts. What is your response? How can this be changed?
What's my response to the claim that the BBC recruits from Oxford and Cambridge and private schools because they're the best people?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
there is no alternative to it. If you want the best people, you go to those places.
Sure. I mean, those are the people who would have gone to the best schools, and those are the people who would have, I mean, we're talking about balanced statistics and balance of probability, but I mean, those are the people who would have grown up in the richest families. That's how the British educational system works. I mean, I think, that could be justified if you wanted people with a certain set of technical skills, which you would want to recruit people with a certain level of education. But in journalism, isn't really like that. I mean, there are skills involved in journalism, and it's not something that anybody can just do in an amateurish way. But if you look at the history of journalism up to the period, like the late 1980s, the early 1990s, it was something which you were said to learn on the job through particular types of professional routines. It was more of a craft. And the idea that actually what you need is a particular set of expertise or education is relatively recent. So we already know that that's not necessary to actually perform the job of being a journalist. I mean, just very narrowly speaking on the BBC, I mean, there was a big push for this, which actually went hand in hand with the marketisation agenda of the early 1990s. So John Burke, who I mentioned earlier, was very explicit about saying that we have to be recruiting from these kinds of educational institutions, because he felt that journalism populated by people who didn't have the sort of intellectual caliber of his friends. Now, that's all well and good if you believe that those institutions are producing people with like greater sort of analytical capacities and so on. But of course, what comes with that in reality is, number one, a certain sort of worldview, a certain understanding of what's important in British society, and, like it or not, a certain sort of social network which goes with your class background. But number two is socialization into a broader network of people. So, you can't just say, oh, the problem here is like people having gone to the same schools, but that's where that sort of socialization starts. And I think, it develops a training actually, which is nothing particularly to do with a set of expertise, but more a kind of shared disposition that seems to develop around particularly Oxford, but the other elite universities as well. And it's the really striking feature of British public life. Something like Social Mobility Commission, the people who run in the BBC and the people who are the top journalists who sort of define the sort of, the terms of its journalism, the tone and the rest of it, they're all from the same educational social strata as the people running the other the powerful institutions of British society. So not just the private press, but the state, so politicians who are actually a little bit more diverse than the BBC on some measures, the judicial system and all of the rest of it. So, the data on that's pretty clear. I mean, they share this kind of social background. And I think, once you strip away the ideology, I mean, the problems are pretty clear, because you have basically an institution which is supposed to represent the diversity of British society across its regions and its class, and they're all drawn mostly from the southeast of England, mostly from a very narrow social strata. So we're talking about, 7% of the population who go to private schools, roughly sort of 30% who I guess are drawn from the professional middle classes in terms of their family background, like I am, and you have large swathes of the population who are just completely unrepresented. And that's not even, we can talk about class, which is the BBC itself has been trying to address and acknowledges is the problem. But if you think about, Scotland, for example, is just not represented seriously in BBC programs, but also the north of England. I mean, you have the north is sort of treated in BBC programming like it's somewhere that the reporters will go to and sort of make generalizations about. You don't have a south of England correspondent who sort of, moves around the South making generalizations about the culture there to try and explain it to viewers. So there's lots of taken for granted assumptions about what the BBC should be doing and what the issues are, and all of that obviously comes from the class background of the people running it. And it's not like they're not aware of this fact. Often the BBC are quite open about some of the problems. The issue is, and sometimes they have very good policy documents and even policy solutions, but the problem is they don't really have the institutional capacity to actually address them in any substantive way.
Who has?
Well, you need to have a serious reform of the BBC, and in order to do that, you would have to have a government which was willing to overhaul the BBC. When we had the prospect of that for a short period in the UK, it doesn't look at the moment like this is a significant issue for the Labour Party. I mean, it's not particularly surprising given the circumstances of COVID, but at the moment, most of the energy in terms of changing the shape and the culture of the BBC is coming from the right. So the Johnson government, over the course of the election, started to make threatening noises towards the BBC. It's been quite repressive in terms of its treatment of the media in general. And immediately after the election announced it was going to decriminalise the licence fee, which was basically a move to try and starve the BBC of funds. And then started briefing the Times saying that they wanted to move towards a subscription model. So at the moment, there's very little prospect of being able to address the long-standing problems with the BBC. There are ways that we could do that if there was a political option available. But in actual fact, the issue that's faced at the moment is more that what the BBC is likely to either be made worse or, eventually sort of phased out. So essentially what the policy agenda at the moment is a combination of intimidation, placing key political appointees, the top of the BBC, which is a long-standing Conservative practice. So Tim Davie, the current Director General, is from the commercial wing of the BBC. He's a former Conservative activist. And then we're going to see David Clementi, who's the chair, replaced in February. So the BBC will be moving to the right. It will be starved of funds. That would mean lots of job cuts. And then come 2027, which is when the current charter comes to an end, the hope is on the Conservative, or parts of the Conservative administration, that the BBC would be significantly curtailed by that point to limit its production capacity even further. So that's the sort of direction of travel at the moment.
It appears contradictory considering how you have documented the cooperation between the BBC and the secret state in the past and the revolving door. Why would one want to starve it of funds considering it's so useful?
Well, the simple answer is that everything that isn't the BBC in the British media landscape, I mean, possibly, accepting The Guardian as well, is positive cheerleader for conservatism. So from the perspective of the Conservatives, they like that element of the BBC. They like the fact that it's supportive generally of British foreign policy, that it's attentive to the interests of the British state. And often, actually, even with the briefings that were assumed to come from Dominic Cummings, Downing Street after the election, that they mentioned that they'd want the BBC to focus more on its foreign operations. So they valued the BBC as an instrument of state propaganda. But in terms of their management of domestic politics, you've got to put the BBC in the context of the broader media landscape, which is basically they have people who are literally lying to keep them in power or to win elections, and will attack any political opposition to the Conservative Party and its allies with extraordinary political ferocity and a complete lack of scruples. Now, the BBC is not, for constitutional reasons, going to operate in the same way as those media groups do, and neither will The Guardian, for the same sorts of reasons, that they're basically operating within a broadly sort of liberal professional model of journalism where you're not supposed to lie about things and you're not supposed to be sort of sensationalist and so on and so forth. Now, from that perspective, although the BBC generally reflects elite interests in society, it doesn't completely marginalise oppositional voices. So, they do appear, and the fact that there's some flawed sort of implementation of impartiality on certain issues means that there's always scope for the government to be angry with the BBC over this, that, or the other. The other thing is that, just the fact that the BBC is more trusted and has a very large share of the market means that it does represent sort of a bloc. Particularly, we're talking about, the right of the Conservative Party here, not really the centre of gravity around the British state and elite interest, but the right of the Conservative Party. For them, basically, the BBC embodies a certain set of values which, whilst they're not left-wing, are anathema to Conservative ideology. So, the BBC is certainly not anti-racist, and it's often been, in recent years, a platform for hard-right racist political opinion. But at the same time, it has embodied certain values or aspirations in terms of fairness, in terms of full representation of British society, in terms of not scaremongering. Now, this isn't to praise the BBC. I think on many of these issues, its reporting and it's has been very bad, but it still represents sort of a counterpoint to some of the more propagandistic journalism that you get from the press. So that's the simple answer. That's basically the reason. The other reason is that the BBC is not completely an instrument of the government. It does have a limited amount of freedom. And for that reason, it's useful for any government to intimidate the BBC further. So the BBC is basically being kept between sort of genuine independence and being a complete instrument of government propaganda. Now, if you put yourself in a position of the government there, that's quite a useful place to have the BBC, because it means that people are going to be more trusting of it than if it was just straightforward mouthpiece to the government. But equally, it's also useful for you to apply as much pressure on the BBC as possible, particularly when it comes to points of political crisis or political strategy, because it's precisely because the BBC is vulnerable to those kinds of pressures that you're able to apply it. So it's very useful for you as a government to, number one, put the BBC under relentless political pressure, and number two, limit the BBC's capacity for independence. And that's why governments, particularly right-wing governments like the Blair government or the current government, will do a number of things. Like, one is reduce the BBC's funding or threaten to reduce the BBC's funding, and another is to keep the BBC under relentless political pressure. So that means intimidation, constant bullying from Downing Street. It means, threats to abolish the BBC come the next charter renewal. So it's manipulating the basically precarious position, the precarious independence that the BBC has, and that has an effect. So that's why I think that Channel 4 News or ITV News, although there are certain political vulnerabilities there as well, but that's why they tend to be better than the BBC. They don't have that key link to government in terms of funding, in terms of appointment, but they're also put under a lot less political pressure. So they're a bit more free and they're a bit less attacked, basically. So that's why their journalism tends to be better.
Could you please address the question of the BBC's independence in light of what was known as formalities? And to what extent is it still going on? Is the BBC infiltrated by agents of the state, a la Operation Mockingbird?
Well, so formalities was a sort of euphemism that used to describe the process of political vetting, and basically this went on from the earliest days of the BBC up until the 1980s when it was discovered, and then it was rolled back. Now, as far as we know, there isn't any current process of political vetting by the secret state at the BBC, but what we do know is that there are, relatively close relationships. We know that the BBC remains close to the Foreign Office, and we can, I think, safely see MI6 on security reporting. Of course, like the journalists who work in that area maintain quite close relationships to MI5. That's a routine sort of process which anyone on that kind of journalistic beat at the BBC will keep those interests close to them, in the same way as if you're a so-called defence reporter, you will foster sources at the Ministry of Defence. The formalities element was something a little bit further, which was that basically if you wanted to work at the BBC, your CV had to go to a spy, so an MI to go to MI5 that would then have to approve or disapprove you on the basis of your politics. So this was part of one particular feature that became very became a sort of public scandal that was actually part of a broader covert relationship between the secret state and the BBC that endured for the whole of the Cold War period. And I think, again, the picture's not very clear. We don't know exactly what the relationship is, but I think that there's good reason to suspect that this also endured into the Cold War and terror period as well. But the simple answer to your question is that we just don't know. And there's no reason why we would expect to know, really. I think what is clear is that the intelligence services can rely on the media as reliable outlets for their information operations. That's a matter of public record, and I think it's fair to say that you could rely on the BBC for that. But as I say, there's no evidence of an ongoing political vetting operation at the BBC, and I would be surprised if it was still going on. It's not beyond the realms of possibility, but it's just the nature of researching the secret state that we simply don't know. So it's just not a very satisfactory answer, but that is the answer.